Hey everyone, hope everyone is being safe out there with the current conditions. And thank you for being here and for listening to this talk. My name is Ketan. I've been a product manager in the Valley for several years now, and I'm excited here to be talking to you all today and sharing some of my stories. I've given a few talks here over the years with Product School, though today I'm particularly excited as I'm talking about something that's really close to my heart. I want to share my own stories of prioritization, and I want to talk about the lessons around prioritization that I've learned while being a PM. Before we begin, I want to quickly introduce myself and share a little bit about myself. I'm currently a PM at Coalition, which is a cybersecurity and cyber insurance startup that's really disrupting the security and insurance space for small and medium-sized enterprises. Though until recently, I spent several years on the product team at Dropbox, and I was building out Dropbox's ecosystem team through strategic integrations and partnerships. I also spent time at Dropbox on a variety of other teams, including the growth and data infrastructure teams prior to our IPO. And prior to Dropbox, I worked at an enterprise analytics SaaS startup called as Applied Predictive Technologies. And prior to that, I was unsuccessfully trying to build startups out of MIT. So before I dive into prioritization, a good question to ask is, what does a product manager exactly do? And depending on whom you ask, you might get very different answers. And in general, this is a hard question to answer. I ended up Googling for it, and this is what I came up with. Well, if you look at this, my mom thinks that I'm Steve Jobs, launching the next hottest product. I think that I'm Superman saving the day from near disaster. But really, if we look at ourselves, what product managers are at some times are just some chickens running around with their heads cut off, not really knowing what's going on. Though, sort of coming back and being a little bit more serious about it, if you were to ask, what does a product manager do? Some of you might say some of the following things that are shown on this slide. You might say, a product manager's job is to write specifications. It is to work with engineering and design. It is to figure out the product vision and strategy. It is to align stakeholders, talk to users, analyze data and metrics, and so on and so forth. So a lot of different tasks that a product manager really does. But if you really peel back the layers and ask, what is at the core of a product manager role? You'll quickly find that many of these tasks that a typical product manager does at some large companies is usually dedicated to some other role. So for instance, talking to customers. Sure, product managers do that, and I advise every PM to spend a lot of time with their customers, but user research helps with that. Supporting customers. At small companies, product is customer support. But at larger companies, customer support steps in. Enabling sales and marketing, that's product marketing's job at large companies. So really what I'm trying to say here is, if you really peel back the layers on all the different things that you think a product manager is supposed to do, what's really at the core of a PM's role is prioritization. And what I mean by prioritization is building the right product for the right user at the right time. So I typically joke saying it's doing this and sitting in meetings and sending a lot of emails. That's what a PM does. But we say prioritization is right product for right user at right time. But there are a lot of nuances to this. You might not be building a product. You might be adding enhancements or new features to an existing product. The right user implies that you know who the right user is. And for several products, there could be multiple user groups. Like for enterprise products, you typically have a user and a buyer that you might have to think about. Or you might have to think about different user segments when you think about prioritization. And finally, the right time. It's not just about the why, but also about the why now. So how would one think of prioritization? How do you go about doing this right product for the right user at the right time? Well, with a prioritization matrix, of course. And most of you who are either PMs or are looking to be a PM have seen some form of a chart like this before, right? It's called by various names: prioritization table. It's called as an ROI matrix. And fundamentally, what you're doing is you have a set of features that you want to prioritize. In this case, employee onboarding and federal tax setup. You look at the value that each feature will give you, and typically that's measured by some sort of like an improvement on a metric that you can measure. You look at the cost, most often the engineering investment, and then you calculate the ROI on each of those features by seeing, hey, how much value can I get per unit of cost? And then you say, like this feature, I guess in this image, the employee onboarding offers like 16.7% improvement relative to the federal tax setup feature, which offers 11% improvement per engineering week. You calculate the ROI and you say, we should work on employee onboarding, right? Well, while this is one way to think about prioritization, real product building and real prioritization tends to be a lot more nuanced. It's more of an art and less of a, I'll put down some numbers and really figure out a sorted list of exactly what I need to do. And this ROI matrix, to be honest with you all, is not a bad place to start. It's, for a first cut, it's pretty decent way to think about things. Though really what I want to do is share some of my own stories and experience across prioritization that go beyond the ROI matrix or this prioritization table across the various roles that I've had. And I wish to share some nuances through some of my own stories that have led me to learn some lessons. And hopefully that becomes a practical sort of talk for everyone. And we all get something out of it. So what I want to do today is share 4 of my learnings around prioritization and share some stories around it. So my 4 lessons or learnings around prioritization are these 4. Number 1, don't prioritize features. Number 2, don't focus on customer wants. Number 3, don't build an ROI matrix. And number 4, don't work on improving your product. Some of you who are looking at this might be saying, wait a second, is this right? Like, this doesn't make any sense at all. Don't focus on customer wants. Don't focus on improving your product. What kind of a prioritization is that? Well, before we go any further, I'll promise you that I'm a real PM. I'm not a phony guy making some stuff up. And I will promise you that it'll all make sense. So let's dive in. So my first lesson that I experienced was to not prioritize features. So what do I mean by that? First, let me start off with a story. And this story is from my time at Dropbox. At Dropbox, I was the product lead on a team called Ecosystem that managed our product integrations and partnerships. And particularly, I worked on this project called as Dropbox extensions. Think of extensions as sort of being similar to Chrome extensions, where you can install third-party applications, though you're installing these applications on your Dropbox and you're building file-related workflows. So some examples here, as seen in the screenshot, are you can install applications that will allow you to take a PDF file and send it for signature. It'll allow you to send it to someone via email. It'll allow you to edit it and so on. So really, you're building these file-related workflows with these extensions, and that's what we were looking to build and support for the product. And what happened was, that was our vision, and we built this platform to support a variety of apps to enable these workflows. And then we launched this feature with much fanfare with an initial set of partners, some of which you're seeing in the slide deck here. Our goal for launching this feature or platform was to drive WCUs. And WCUs stands for weekly collaborative users. So think of this as like a metric that is a variant of weekly active users. The only difference was that at Dropbox, we valued users who are not just active, but were collaborative. And the fundamental goal of this feature was to drive the number of weekly users who are collaborative. And as I said, we launched this platform with a lot of fanfare and press. I spoke with TechCrunch, I spoke with Engadget, ZDNet. We tweeted about it, we published blog posts. But once we launched, we noticed something that was not as impressive. Our usage was really low and users were not at all coming back to use it. And this sort of a thing happens a lot, where you might launch a brand new feature within a product, and the product itself, may be heavily used, but your feature may end up being a hit or miss. And more often than not, despite all of your efforts on user research, getting signals, it does sometimes tend to be a miss, right? And so in this situation, what happened was I had launched Dropbox extensions. I was super excited about it, but we were stuck with no usage and really poor retention. And there was one big problem. We as a team didn't know what to build to solve for this metric, right? And the industry term for such a situation is called feature product fit. And feature product fit, it's a term that was popularized by Casey Winters. You can Google for it. It's really, in a nutshell, describes a situation where, or lack of a feature product fit describes a situation where your feature is not being adopted. And those who might adopt it or try it are really not retaining on that particular feature. So as a whole, your feature is not being valued and your users are not getting a better experience because you launched this feature. And so our goal instantly at that point became finding this elusive thing called as the feature product fit. We didn't know what features to build, but we wanted to find out what we need to do to make it more valuable. So what did we do? We went back and talked to users constantly. We figured out what their real underlying motivations were. And particularly what we did was we bucketed our users into 3 segments. We found users that were retaining. We found users who had used it once and had abandoned it. And then we found users who had never even used it. And then we started talking to them. We tried to identify what was the real thing that was differentiating these 3 user segments. We got some ideas, not sure what we wanted to build. We took those hypotheses, designed a bunch of experiments, and we thought of how we could run these experiments faster. We optimized our processes around learning, and we even changed our team motto. We said our team motto is learn faster. And what we didn't have in all of these processes was like a long list of features in like a well-created roadmap, right? And so ultimately, before going there, we did build a bunch of these experiments. We started running them, and we were able to get ourselves up to 100,000 weekly collaborative users over the course of a few weeks. And my learning or lesson from this whole experience and the takeaway was, sometimes the products or the features that you launch don't do so well. And there are times when you don't know what to build and what features to prioritize, simply because you don't know what's resonating with users or where value really lies. And so at that time, what you really need to do is not prioritize features. You want to prioritize moving fast, learning quickly, and saving time. This actually reminds me of like a Mark Zuckerberg quote. He was once asked in a Y Combinator interview, what mistakes should you avoid while building a startup? And then his answer was, if you're building a startup, you can't really avoid the mistakes. All you need to do is just move really fast, learn quickly, and adapt. And that is the same sort of a mindset that you need to take when you are thinking of building really, really good products. My next lesson in prioritization is not focusing on customer wants. You might say, wait, that makes even less sense. As a PM, you have to focus on customer wants, like not focus on the customers. Okay, I'll tell another story here. So when I first joined Dropbox, I was the product manager on an internal analytics tools team. And a company like Dropbox has very diverse analytic needs, and the team had been very ambitious and had taken on building and maintaining 8 separate analytics products, even though our team was just 8 engineers big. And this huge workload of each engineer basically having to maintain an entire product and build new features on top of it was simply burning the team out. And even though our team itself was suffering, our customers for each of these tools, and in some cases, some of these customers some of these tools had several hundred customers, were deriving legitimate value from each of these tools. And at least for those customers, these tools were semi-critical, if not important. And each of these tools, the customers that were using them had like a long list of asks for each of these products. And these asks were legitimate. So think about this: 8 engineers, 8 products, 8 roadmaps, and God knows how many set of features. But we couldn't sustain this because the team was really burning out. And we felt that we were stuck between a rock and a hard place. And what we had to do then was we really had to prioritize the team ahead of the customers. We couldn't really serve our customer if we didn't have a team. So what we did then was we cut down the development to just 1 out of those 8 products, and we kept the other, a couple of them on just life support mode to give respite to the engineers. For the others, we just had to brutally prioritize and just cut support. We just said, hey, these are not supported anymore. And it was really painful because we were letting down a lot of our customers. But because, part of this was maybe avoided because these were internal customers, but still it felt like we were giving up on a lot. But ultimately what happened was the team was thankful. The team could focus on one specific product. We could deliver that one product, keeping the other 7 on hold. And then over time, we were able to improve the team's health, and the team was able to grow over time. At another time on one of these teams, my team was working through some foundational work to help developers become more efficient. And I struck a contract with my team to dedicate 30% of our team's time each sprint to improve and work on tech debt to make us more efficient. Was the customer getting any value out of this? Not directly, but what we focused on was to keep the engineers happy, increase their productivity, and look longer term. That is, optimize for the future output of that team. And coming back to that learn faster example that I shared from earlier, on that same team for Dropbox extensions, we were running a lot of experiments. But after a quarter of running experiments, some of the engineers on the team longed to work on something larger versus smaller experiments. So the EM came to me and talked about whether there were opportunities for us to prioritize big chunks of work, large work streams that would get engineers excited. So I worked with my EM and we created these teams that would give engineers something substantial to work on, keep them excited. And so the takeaway for me here is that often there is another stakeholder for building product that's beyond your different user groups that you might traditionally think of. It is your team itself. So if you focus purely on your customers' wants, but neglect the team's needs, then you will not be in great shape. So think about, as you're thinking of prioritization, think about efficiency improvements, think about foundational work, think about work that would get your team excited. And usually I partner with the tech lead and the EM to figure out how we can balance this, this notion of helping the customer, but also keeping the team sane and working happily, and consider that in your prioritization. My third lesson is don't build an ROI matrix, right? And I talked earlier about how prioritization is a little bit more of an art and a science. You just can't be perfect about it because there is no right answer, because ultimately you're trying to make decisions in the absence of complete information. And that example that I showed you where you said a feature has an ROI of 16.7%, another feature has an ROI of 15.2%. In reality, I've been a PM for many years. It just doesn't work that way. You are making calls based on intuition. You're making calls based on some notion of data. You're relying on a variety of signposts and guideposts to guide you in the right direction. But there isn't hey, here's the holy grail way to do prioritization. But what I did want to maybe share was, sometimes the situation is different, right? And you might not even need to build a prioritization matrix. And the reason I say that is because the prioritization might be so blatantly obvious that you may not even see, you may not even realize that. You all might have seen this comic strip before. I like this a lot because we think it's funny, but in reality, many of us unknowingly fall into this state where you're sitting around and there's this big thing happening around you, and you don't realize that that is happening, and that's where you need to pour your attention. And so what I mean by that is, what needs to be prioritized may be really obvious, and there is really no need for like, a crazy deep analysis to say like, oh, we have 15 features, like which one will we build first? But we may not realize that. And as a product manager, I myself have been guilty of complicating things in the past. I specifically remember this one meeting from a couple of years ago at Dropbox, where we were having this long and deep prioritization conversation about which big integration to build. And we were sitting there in this multi-hour meeting talking about the different integrations and efforts that we could potentially do. But just this one number kept staring at my face: $250 million and above. And that was the one number that made our prioritization obvious. That number, 250 million, is the number of common users between Dropbox and Gmail. To really make an impact to Dropbox users and to help them connect their workflows and tools more easily, we had to build the best integration experience for Dropbox with Gmail. And the reason why we thought that this realization became obvious is this number was so large, and the number of users who were using these two tools was so large that everything else just paled in comparison. And it became obvious that this is what we needed to work on. And what we ended up doing was we built a Gmail integration, and within like a couple of weeks, it became like one of the top ranking apps on the Gmail app platform. So the Gmail one might have been a little bit more obvious, and you might say, hey, like, how did you not see that? I have several examples, but maybe talk another one that was maybe a bit less obvious. So at Applied Predictive Technologies, which is where I started my product career, we built analytics software. And this was complicated analytics software. We let users run tons of complicated analyses on large data sets. And people used this product, and the product was called Test and Learn, because they had to. And it ran specific kinds of analyses that their bosses required, and so on and so forth. But what I was just poking around the data at some point in time, and what I noticed was that what people, and specifically some set of our core users, what they loved most was this one tiny data visualization tool that actually let them see and explore data without any complex analysis, right? So these are like sales and marketing analysts, and they're just creating some simple graphs and simple charts and so on. And the reason, which I found out later, was that they were using this tiny visualization tool instead of our giant, like, complicated engine, was because all of their data in their own organizations was maintained by IT in various silos and was out of reach for these analysts. And on our side, this data visualization tool was just maintained and built by one engineer in his spare time. But it was this thing that our users loved most about our product. And so I was like, wait a second, like how did we not see this before? And so once we started talking to users about it and even did basic analysis around it, it became so obvious that this was the most important thing, and we had to prioritize this effort and make this visualization tool more integrated with our core platform, more suited to the kinds of analyses our users were trying to do, and more suited to provide the kind of data that our users needed. And so once we saw this light on how important this tiny tool was for our customers to see their own data, like, our roadmap completely changed. And so my takeaway here is, at times, the path to prioritization is really difficult, and you have to make a lot of tough decisions, and you have to go into these like crazy meetings with stakeholders and figure out like where you really need to put your effort in. But in sometimes it's not really, that hard because it's more of an art. You might be staring right at it and you might not see it. One trick that a coach taught me to do this is to have explicit thinking time. And so my coach said, hey, Ketan, you seem to be just doing and doing and doing, and you're like this like hamster on like a like one of those circular running wheels, and you're just like constantly running. You're not taking time to step out of that and actually see the larger picture. And so we get stuck in this rut, And so what I started doing then was to explicitly take thinking time, and I would block my calendar and say, this is thinking time. And I'll just sit, not look at email, nothing, just like think about how we're doing product, like what our users are telling us, are we making the right set of decisions, and so on. So taking that step back, seeing that larger picture could help you see what might be obvious in terms of prioritization. And especially when you have minimal information, you rely a little bit on your intuition and experience to tell you what might be the one to work on. My final lesson is don't work on improving the product. And hopefully by now, you know that when I say don't work on improving the product, I don't really mean don't improve your product. Of course, you should be improving your product over time and making it better for your users. But what else should you be doing? So another story, and what I mean by what you need to do beyond product is actually process. So here's a story of a time where it didn't matter how much we improved our product. What really mattered was improving the process surrounding it. And so this experience came from my time on the analytics and data infrastructure team at Dropbox. And so, once our team became healthy, we were building and maintaining all of these different tools. And we noticed that many of these customers who were supposed to be using these tools were simply not using it. And turned out that the reason that these people were not using these tools, such as visualization and dashboarding, was simply because the data that they were seeing in these charts was not reliable. And since the underlying data was bad, users didn't use these tools at all. It was a scenario where what was happening was it was garbage in and garbage out. And since the usage of our product was not affected by the quality or the functionality within the product itself, we had to look at the underlying data and the process that generated that underlying data. We had to build processes around data integrity, hire an entirely new data engineering team, classify data as being source of truth or just basically created as a copy. And at that point in time, we had to prioritize the process, not the product. A more recent example, another one along those veins, is a story from my time at Coalition. And we were doing several deadline-driven projects, as one does at a startup. Some of these were really high priority, high impact projects, right? And the implementation of these high priority projects was okay. Though, like right at the end, there was always an issue with testing, right? And when I say testing, you probably have seen some of these issues where we send or ship products super early to testing. And I love like Dilbert's take on product development. Huge fan. But really like what was happening was we were shipping either really broken code and basically providing a terrible user experience for our customers who were excited to try this, or who were just sort of tripping at the finish line, where just before our launch date or launch deadline, we were having these stressful nights, like finding tons and tons of bugs manually and fixing them late into the night. And in these cases as well, like I quickly realized like our product was okay. Like what we were building, the use cases we were tackling, our just overall requirements, design, everything was good. What was broken was the testing piece, that the process around testing was broken. So what we did was we sat down and said, hey, this is not going well with the stakeholders. And we said, let's write down explicit testing requirements and acceptance criteria for each of our deadline-driven projects. Not just deadline-driven, but the ones where it matters the most is the deadline-driven ones. And then we said like, hey, how can we like put down a more structured testing process with the QA team? How can we test against known and valid business cases, right? And this is something that you might experience, especially if you're working at early stage companies, where you might not realize the necessity for a process if your team is really small. But as your team grows, you're taking up larger projects, you have some tech debt to worry about, really putting together a process in place makes all the difference at times. And at Coalition right now, we're working on a project to deliver in June, and we're trying to instrument this like new process around it. And so my takeaway here when it comes to prioritization is don't think just about the product itself, but don't think about the product itself, but think about the process surrounding it. And my recommended way to think about it is, if you think about like, your product as like this box and it has these boundaries, the process or the processes associated with the product that are at the boundary of your product contribute to a user's product experience as well. And this is not just external user experience. It could be an internal user experience, right? The whole process of building itself, might totally be more efficient, more enjoyable, and more fun. Whereas the external processes typically are like customer support, documentation, like things of that nature, are process things that really help change how people perceive your product. And one of the reasons, like if you take like best-in-class products, take Amazon, for instance, their process around customer support is a part of experiencing the product, and that's incredible. Think of Stripe as an example. They cater to developers, and their documentation, which often is overlooked used to be at least overlooked in many companies, Stripe documentation is top-notch and is an industry standard. And one of the reasons why developers love to use their product is because the documentation, which is not the core product itself, it's about how to use the product, is in stellar shape. So, think about not just your product, but the process surrounding it as well. So in summary, what I did want to do here was recap the 4 lessons that I had, which is don't just prioritize features, but think of, prioritizing your team and your own learning and time when you think about prioritization. Particularly if you are, at an early stage startup, you might be thinking of product market fit, and you're racing towards that, moving quickly. That's what matters. You don't know what to build. But at a more established product, you're thinking about that feature product fit, and still in scenarios you're learning and moving quickly matters. Next lesson was don't just focus on the customer wants, but think of your internal team's needs. Whether that's your engineering team's needs, your design team's needs, you have to have a successful team to build a successful product. You want to have a happy team. And one of my mentors used to tell me that the identity of a product often reflects the nature of the team behind it. So if you have a chaotic team and an unhappy team, you will build products that will have poorer experience. So don't neglect your team. Keep tech debt in mind. Keep like engineering efficiency and developer efficiency in mind, and so on. Third lesson is don't prioritize with an ROI matrix, but work on what's obvious. Though, as I said earlier, you might have to take a step back, really think, see the larger picture, analyze data to figure out what might be like obvious and staring in your face. Sort of that looking at that comic, that This Is Fine comic, and seeing like, actually there is fire everywhere. I should put out that fire. And then finally, don't prioritize improving the product, or just improving the product, but improve the process around it as well. It leads to a better experience both internally and externally, whether that's for your own team or for your customers. And that's what I had to share here. Wanted to share really some of my own lessons and learnings over this time. And I did want to say thank you to everyone who tuned in and listened. Hope you all are staying safe and working remotely, and finding new ways to work, especially as PMs, where we can't like sit across our counterparts face to face. Though happy to sort of like help people answer questions and things of that nature. Simply, if you want to find me on the interwebs, you can just find me on Twitter. My handle is @Ketan Nayak. So thank you for listening in, everyone. And hopefully you and your family stay safe.